Well, I'd like to welcome you to this In Focus session of the GTNF. It's a real pleasure to have three fantastic colleagues and friends join me in discussing what we think is something requiring far greater attention, namely putting our focus on people who smoke and their struggles and how we might actually give them greater support from a behavioral, psychological, knowledge perspective. Um, I have with me, I'm not going to go through everybody's bios, but I have Mohammadi Sakar, Jessica Zrinak, and Kotha Hajat. Mohammadi and Jessica will join me initially in some of the early panel discussions, and then we've asked Kotha to give a broad commentary from her public health perspective of where she sees some of the gaps or the issues that we need to have greater attention to. So just before I start, I'm trying to, we all hope that you'll keep in mind not the traditional epidemiological numbers, which I spend my career focused on, but individual smokers. So to help you, we're going to refer to Sheila, who is a 53-year-old woman, a Black woman, who smoked a pack of menthol cigarettes for 35 years and was recently hospitalized for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease exacerbation. So Sheila, she smoked a long time. John is a 62-year-old white male who lives in West Virginia, where the smoking rate is among the highest in the country. And he smoked about a pack and a half for 40 years and came into a hospital with a heart attack. He is also overweight, and he's had a range of other health problems over his life. Ayita is a woman of 45 years living on a Native American territory where she smoked since she was 15. Most of her extended family smoke. She has early-stage cardiovascular disease and mild depression. And finally, Yun, a 50-year-old man living in Seoul, Korea, and has smoked a pack a day since he was 20 years old. He's relatively fit, but has frequent bouts of bronchitis. And importantly, his doctor also smokes, not unusual in Korea. So let me start with you, Mohammadi. I'd love you maybe just to give your motivation for actually being involved in trying to help people to stop smoking, and then paint a picture of the reality for any of the people I mentioned, and what barriers you felt they had to face and how they could be overcome in trying to get them to end smoking.
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Derek, for the level setting. Before I share my insights regarding what can we do for these individuals, I think we need to step back and remind ourselves about the problem that we're here to address. We are here to talk about the billion people who smoke worldwide and more than 30 million who smoke in the US. These people are not just a faceless statistics, as you mentioned. They are human beings just like you and me. And so I want to kind of pick up on the individuals that you shared about and provide a personal dimension to this conversation from my years of tenure in academia as well as at Altria as a clinical researcher, where I have personally worked with many of them closely. And I'm going to identify with the two individuals that I knew personally. So this story is about Sheila and John. And I met them when I was conducting smoking cessation research at West Virginia University Medical Center. Of course, I've changed their names to maintain their privacy. So Sheila came to the hospital with COPD exacerbation, and John presented with a myocardial infarction. Now, the sad part of this story is that when they were discharged from the hospital, we offered them pharmacotherapy and behavioral support to quit. But they were just not interested in quitting. So what can we do for people like Sheila and John and millions who are unable or unwilling to quit? Now, we know that the traditional strategies don't work for all, right? So we need a pragmatic alternative approach of harm reduction, which involves switching from cigarettes to smoke-free products. And what do I mean by smoke-free products? These are products that are not combusted, like e-vapor, heated tobacco products, and oral tobacco products. And in order for harm reduction to work, we need to understand their barriers and motivators so that we can meet them where they are. Now, one of the most significant barriers is disinformation, and that has created misperceptions. There is a widespread and deeply rooted misbelief that smoke free products are equally or even more harmful than cigarettes. For example, 90% of adults have this misperception about smokeless tobacco products. Past data has shown that the misperceptions regarding e vapor products have steadily increased compared to 40% in 2014. In 2021, a staggering 80% believed that e vapor products are equally or even more harmful than cigarettes. Not only that, nicotine misperceptions are also equally pervasive, right? In a publication by scientists from FDA, 75% of adults who smoke cigarettes believed that nicotine causes smoking related cancer. And the research by Steinberg et al. Showed that 80% of doctors believe that nicotine causes cancer. Now we know that this is not true. Both IARC and WHO have reviewed the evidence and concluded that nicotine is not a carcinogen. So this discordance between the belief and the facts is a huge barrier. So let's talk about how can we knock down this barrier and turn them into motivators. One motivator is providing them with accurate and non-misleading information about these products. There should be a unified and consistent message from all, including FDA and other public health authorities. And this communication should be specifically targeted to people who smoke, and it can actually be very simple. For example, if you smoke, you should quit. If you cannot quit, then consider switching to smoke free products. It can be as simple as that. Now, because people like Sheila and John trust the doctor and other public health agencies, all stakeholders need to provide this consistent message. Now, we also know, right, that correcting these misperceptions has worked. We have seen this has been successful in other countries like UK and Sweden, where smoking rates have rapidly declined and at the same time has not created an on-ramp for youth. Another motivator is making products available and accessible that are satisfying. Now, individuals who smoke should have, at least in the US, have a variety of FDA authorized products to choose from. And the availability of these choices is going to be important. Let me give you an example. What do you mean by that? So, for example, we observed in our PMTA studies with the on-nicotine pouches that 28% of adults switched completely from cigarettes to these nicotine pouches within 6 weeks. And of course, this was an experimental setting. Nonetheless, the results were quite striking. And not only that, those who switched told us that the availability of a variety of optional flavors was an important reason for the switching behavior. So for harm reduction to succeed, no single product will satisfy all people who smoke, and multiple smoke-free products will be needed to completely transition them away from cigarettes.
Thanks. We're going to come back to you for more, but I just want to keep us moving to Jessica next, if that's okay. But I think you raised many points, and I just want to really make one key one that's often hidden in there. I'm always struck by the fact that people are unaware that there's a commonality between people with tuberculosis, people with schizophrenia, and people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Now, this sounds awfully clinical for many people listening, but remember, these are conditions that will kill you if you don't do something about it. In all of those three cases, TB, COPD, and schizophrenia, the majority of patients smoke, the majority. They don't only have the majority who smoke at the start of treatment, but the majority continue to smoke at the end of treatment, representing a colossal failure of the health professionals and of our health system to both show empathy and to recognize that with better approaches, we may be able to make progress. And on that, let me hand over to Jessica, who spent her life's career focusing on these deep behavioral questions about how is it in that setting of so much obvious ill health and risk, we have continued smoking happening. And how do you think about this, Jessica?
Yes, thank you so much, Derek. And I'll be definitely building upon the points that Mohammadi has made as well. So taking a step back, it's really important for us to remember that a person who smokes first is a person. And if we can better understand the background and the basics, the psychology of human behavior and humans, I think we can do a better job at tailoring our smoking cessation programs, our harm reduction programs, and take that on into our regulatory environment. So when we think about human behavior, what I really have not seen, whether it be in our regulatory environment or just the way public health talks about nicotine and tobacco products, and then going even further to that, our healthcare providers, I'm not seeing this basics of psychology. Each human being has basic needs that need to be met in order for them to reach higher needs. So, for example, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it starts with basic physiological needs, which can include food, water, air, and there's various steps in that hierarchy. And an individual cannot reach that top of the pyramid if the other needs are not met. So in a lot of our programs right now, what we see is a very what we see is a very narrow path to getting people to switch. Actually, I'm going to take that back. So what we see now, so at the top of the pyramid is the being able to problem solve, right? So being able to think through and work through complex problems. And an individual cannot do that unless their other needs are met. And so when we think about how a person who smokes can transition off of cigarettes, we have to look and say, are their basic needs met or not? Because we cannot expect them to take that next step to switch, which is a very, very complex behavior change, if they don't have their basic needs met. So when we look at where we are now versus what we know, there's definitely a difference between the two. So I'm going to start actually with what we know, because that seems to just be a better way of framing up that gap between what we know and where we are. So as I mentioned, we know this basic psychological, physiological needs must be met before we can expect a smoker to switch. Then we think about people, we can look at human behavior in a variety of different ways. We can look at it from an individualistic perspective, where there are individual differences within a person, and each person is different. Think about how difficult that would be, though, and how difficult it is to create a harm reduction framework or smoking cessation programs when each person comes into the office and is a different person. But if we can take a step back and say, okay, well, each person is a part of a group. Each person belongs to a society. And so when we look at it from then a group process perspective, one way that I think we can start improving health communications, different regulations, and health policy is to say, let's study the entire population of a certain country, and let's find little pockets of people that within each of these segmentations or these pockets, we have a group of, maybe it's 10 different types of smokers, and their individual needs are going to be different. Maybe my individual need is going to be a group of people who have kids. And so they have kids and they work 2 jobs, and they, different variables about them. We even look at it from a psychological perspective to say, are people high or low on openness to change? Are they high or low on conscientiousness and awareness of how their behavior impacts others? Are they extroverted? Are they introverted? These are all psychological processes, and there are reliable and valid measures out there to assess these aspects of a person, but we're not using them. But think about it. Someone who is conscientious of other people, but maybe is introverted, don't you think that their type of harm reduction strategy or smoking cessation program or advice from their healthcare provider should be tailored to that? Because someone who is introverted doesn't want the group influence. They don't want, and they don't get their energy from that aspect. So we have to remember these basic principles underlying the human being. We also have to think that what we see as behavior is oftentimes being masked by two other aspects of a person. And that's their affect, which is their feelings, and their cognitions, which are their thoughts. It's called the ABCs. So we really should be tailoring our health communications and our programs to capture what people are thinking, what people are feeling, and then finally how that's influencing behavior. So that's what we know. We also know that switching occurs when their needs are met. I just mentioned this earlier with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if we look at an individual who can barely pay their bills or struggle getting food for their family, I'll tell you right now, they are not worried about switching they're not worried about switching from smoking. They're worried about feeding their family. So if we can create programs, policies, we could develop community groups to help with the basic needs, then maybe we can get them to then think higher order. We also know what impacts behavior. As I mentioned, group processes really become a big role here. Social media impacts behavior. And we'll get to this, how we can close this gap in just a second. We also know basic psychology that positive reinforcement works. All people, this is not just within the United States. This is not just within the United States. This is globally. People do what feels good. People do what gives them a reinforcement, a positive response in return. So let's keep that in mind as we continue.
Jessica,
yes.
if I could push you to say, I think you outlined really well what we know about behavior. So maybe you could just briefly say, so where are we in terms of the approaches both of government product availability today to actually make that an easier option for people?
Right. Yes, perfect. So we know these aspects. We also know IQOS was successful. We know consumers are diverse. I've hit on all of these main points you see on the right hand of your screen if you're looking at the slide. We know that healthy choices are effective also at behavior change. So if that's what we know, let's talk about where we are. Well, if you talk to adult smokers, as I do in my career, I travel weekly and I talk to hundreds and hundreds of smokers. They will tell you that they don't have a lot of support from their community. Oftentimes you're talking to an adult smoker who people they are around also smoke. So there's a lack of support there. There's a lack of support in understanding and taking an empathetic approach by their healthcare providers. Smokers will tell you, and I will tell you this is specific to within the United States, they will tell you that their doctors will tell them, just quit. There's no other alternatives provided to them except potential NRTs. And then we are told that those NRTs are ineffective. So what do? They go back to smoking. So there seems to be a lack of support. As Mohammadi mentioned earlier, there's this great misunderstanding of risk. I've even had adult smokers who won't even try an oral nicotine product because they believe it's the nicotine that does the most damage. And so they say that I will just continue smoking my cigarette. We know that from an industry perspective, we have Mohammadi here from Altria. authorization of these products is taking 2 to 3 years, if not longer. So how do you innovate, and how do you go forward with products that are tailored to an adult smoker to get them to switch off of cigarettes if you're so far delayed between where you're developing the product and when it goes live?
Jessica, let me just jump that as well to Mohammadi to also respond briefly. Mohammadi?
Yeah, so let me just pick up on where you ended, Jessica. I totally agree with you. I think that the current regulatory environment, at least in the US, is really chaotic and bogged down. And as many of us know, the FDA commissioner had asked the Reagan-Udall Foundation to do an assessment of the operations of the Center for Tobacco Products. And that committee came out with a report. And one of the things that they said that FDA needs to provide a clear guidelines on the science and evidence that they're going to use to authorize new products and accelerate that authorization process. Because right now it's just, there's the whole PMTA process and the standard of appropriate for the protection of public health is shrouded in mystery. So, clarity on the burden of evidence that would be needed to get those products authorized, and transparency and faster decision making. Another thing that the Reagan-Udall Foundation recommended was that, we need to correct these misperceptions, and consumers need to be made aware of the differential risk. The good news is that FDA has acknowledged these issues and have identified steps that they're going to take towards addressing that. They're going to come up with a strategy that they're going to unfold by the end of this year. And they're going to explore approaches for communicating to adults who smoke regarding the misperceptions they have of nicotine, the lack of information that they have about the differences in the risk. And that should encourage them. And in my comments, I've talked about the publication from the scientists from CTP, and where they showed that 75% of adults who smoke believe that nicotine causes cancer. They said that this discourages them from switching. So I think if we have products available and the right information in front of them, that will enable them to make the right decision for themselves. So Jessica, to your point, we have to meet smokers where they are. We can't force them into a direction where we think that's best for them. Once they are equipped with accurate information and have a variety of choices, a portfolio of products to choose from, different platforms, because smokers are not a monolithic group. Different people have different needs, and maybe it's an inhalable product, maybe it's an inhalable product. So if we have these portfolio of products that are authorized by FDA, then they can make an informed decisions for them. Give them agency, give them control.
Okay, let me go back to Jessica, because I do want to go back to these people we started thinking about and keeping them in mind. So let's go back to West Virginia, or to one of the Native American communities, where there are so many other outside pressures. And I just wonder if availability of the range of products itself is the starting point. If it's not available, how are they going to deal with it? But maybe you could speak to that, Jessica. And what would you be doing in that setting? Either as somebody sitting on the counseling side with a smoker in front of them, or if you're sitting in one of the senators or politicians' offices, or a leading person's office, to say what they should be doing for their community, knowing that one of the responses they're going to say in the case of West Virginia, where we have so much opioid abuse, we have so much obesity, this is not really a top priority for us. Or in the Native American community, poverty is so pervasive, deprivation is a big issue, just give us income. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so I think I would also probably hear that these individuals are unwilling to quit. They don't want to quit. I would first take a step back and say that we have to meet them where they are. I think both of you have mentioned that so far. So in some of these instances, if we talk about Yoon, that's going to be and require a cultural shift. How do you make culture shift? How do you make social and cultural norms shift? You create behavior change through, for example, social media that is happening, through government, through community efforts. So in those instances, that's going to be more difficult and more time consuming because that is an underlying societal shift. In other instances, for example, in West Virginia, our person who smokes there, we have to think about the actual smoker and a person who smokes and where they go and who they trust. And as Mohammadi mentioned it, oftentimes that is going to be their healthcare provider. We also then have to consider maybe it's not their physician, maybe it is their nurse, maybe it is their physician's assistant. If we start there and can get those individuals educated and properly trained to say, these people who smoke need support and they need empathy. They don't need to be told to stop smoking. Here's an NRT and then walked out the door. So there are different strategies, whether or not it is giving them an Apple Watch or a Fitbit, or if you go X number of days without a cigarette, you will receive Y. That's positive reinforcement, right? So you are trying to promote a behavior by giving them something that they are interested in. It also reinforces healthy choices. So if an individual is overweight, has other diseases and other underlying conditions and smokes, let's start with maybe the other aspects of that individual, maybe the being overweight. So let's promote healthy foods. Let's promote, like I mentioned, a Fitbit and an exercise, and get community programs involved to say, hey, we're going to get together on Saturdays at 10 o'clock and walk 100 steps, maybe to start out. West Virginia's physicians have actually started this in their very low income areas. They have their medical providers, a select few of them, come and meet the residents of that area and promote healthy behaviors through walking with them. They do cooking classes with them. And all of that is a one-on-one personalized approach to getting healthier, which then in turn leads typically to reducing your negative health behaviors. I would also say availability, if I could say one other thing, which is availability. We cannot expect an individual on an Indian reserve to switch off of combustible cigarettes if 95% of the products that they are exposed to are combustible cigarettes. So that's where I would turn to us and say, what are we doing to identify these segments that I mentioned earlier? What are we doing to identify these pockets in each of our countries, in each of our locations, to say the typical adult smoker in West Virginia looks like this. The typical smoker in Oklahoma looks like this. Then let's go to them and say, let's study them. Let's talk to them. And let's say, what are those specific barriers? And I might say there might be a heck of a lot more than 10 segments in here in America. But that first step is going to be going to them and seeing how they live. And when you see an individual come to you that says, cigarettes is the only way that I can get through my day, I've tried other stuff, but it doesn't work, that's a task for us to complete. And the other thing is then let's promote it by price. Because right now we are taxing individuals who smoke cigarettes at these rates that they're paying $10, $12 for a pack of cigarettes. So maybe what we can do is go into West Virginia and say, here's these oral nicotine products, and they're $4. Use these instead. But again, we got to make sure that we're using the community support, the medical health provider support, and then also bring in the mental health providers. So bringing in our psychologists and our psychiatrists and getting them on board.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Jessica. And I think one thing which also came through in your talk, and I know we all struggle with it. For those watching, when we started preparing for this session, we felt it was also important to try and introduce a different language around people who smoke, people who are struggling. And you'll see we try our best, but we often slip back to talking about the smoker when it's somebody who happens to smoke. Their full identity isn't being a smoker. And for those insights, I think we can draw from two important areas. One was that I must say that for once, the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco actually led quite a good consultation on this very topic. And it's taken decades to get to this. But their recognition that we've over-stigmatized people who smoke, and the best way to see that stigma is the way we talk about people who may be smokers as well. Once you actually personalize it or think about the struggles of individual, the solutions start actually becoming far clearer in your mind, whether it's the kind of tailoring approach that Jessica mentioned, the close clinical interface that Mohammadi mentioned. And now I'd like to hand over to my colleague Kotha to reflect on what is she picking up from this discussion, particularly knowing, Kotha, that you are sitting in the UK where there's some very big, bold experiments underway. And you also have a depth in understanding the role of behavioral economics and incentivizing healthy behavior. I would just add one small thing. The list that Jessica spoke about of some of the constraints people face, one of them is short-termism and how we overcome it. And I think some of the UK government announcements over the last few weeks probably are intended to help that. But over to you.
Thanks, Derek. It's fantastic to hear the insights from Mohammed and Jessica and yourself. And I'll try to add to that by putting on a public health lens, but also factoring in the comments made by Mohammed and Jessica and the case studies that you mentioned. I've heard a few times now that we need to hear and incorporate the voices and perspectives of the smokers and users themselves. And it's great to hear that from everyone on the panel today. And we found that in our research. So we recently conducted several systematic reviews. And one of the kind of clear messages that was coming out is that out of the thousands of papers and articles that we had reviewed, the voices of the smokers and tobacco users themselves were missing, and they were almost completely ignored. And if we look at the case studies, Aita, whose family all smoke and also has depression, it's unlikely that her receiving untailored advice on smoking cessation is going to be successful. We know that for mental health problems, there is a bidirectional relationship between nicotine use and symptoms from mental health conditions. And so we can't just say to her, stop smoking. And that's likely to have a negative impact on her mental health symptoms as well. And so it needs very careful, it's a complicated situation, needs very careful handling and support. And Jessica mentioned that the support actually is missing for people in the community where they're not going through the more formal smoking cessation clinic setting and trying to use the harm reduction approach. Another point that was mentioned was the more kind of holistic lifestyle behaviors, and people don't smoke with kind of exemplary other lifestyle behaviors. We need to look at the person and all of their lifestyle behaviors together. And Jessica mentioned that factoring in some of the other lifestyle behaviors and tackling those together can have greater impact. And actually, we've done some work on that specifically, and it seems that by incorporating exercise into people's lives, that seems to trigger other healthy behaviors, including quitting smoking. And so, again, I'd really encourage governments and public health bodies to really look at these together. What happens at the moment is people would go to a smoking cessation clinic for their smoking. They may or may not receive help from their GP for exercise, or they may just be trying to tackle that themselves. It would be fantastic to see some of that tackled more holistically, particularly in some of these case studies where there really are several factors. Somebody mentioned the role of doctors. I think it was Mohammed saying that 80% of doctors think that nicotine is unsafe and causes cancer. And we need doctors to be on side. We need doctors to have the correct information and be providing counselling, but also for them to be role models and advocates of tobacco cessation and providing support. And again, some other work that we have conducted showed that doctors who themselves smoke or are ex-smokers are less likely to then provide appropriate support for patients who smoke. And in fact, when we looked at this in South Africa, doctors who smoked, their patients were twice as likely to smoke as those doctors who had never smoked. And so it really does have quite a big role. I think Mohammed mentioned that there needs to be a unified message from authorities, and I can wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think we need a whole ecosystem that really fosters smoking cessation, and so we don't have snippets of services and information. And if I can borrow from the harm reduction approach being used in the fight for climate change and by in the climate science arena, there's a nice framework that looks at upstream, midstream, and downstream factors. So upstream, really, we're talking about aligning business and institutions and industry. And I'll take some data from the Tobacco Transformation Index that showed that compared progress over the last few years, say between 2019 and 2021. And although there are some strategic commitments that have been made, progress actually is very slow, and it certainly is not enough to transition to being smoke-free. And so what I would like to see is more focus both in high-income countries, but also in low and middle-income countries. And when we look at industry, only 3% at the moment of activity is in low and middle-income countries. And we should bear that in mind when we're talking about behaviour science, that they do not have access to safer products in low and middle-income countries to the same extent. At midstream, really, we need to build an enabling environment. And what we're seeing is regulation of nicotine products that are not proportionate to their risk. And if we look in particular at smokeless tobacco, we see products being used in Asia, in India, we see being used in Sweden. In Sweden, they have led to, through a reverse gateway effect, led to Sweden becoming smoke-free, having less than 5% smoking rates. And the resulting health impact is a halving of tobacco attributable deaths and smoking-related deaths compared with the rest of Europe, where snus in particular has been banned. And so we really need to look at that as a kind of best practice example of how we can really end smoking in our generation and in our lifetimes. And in stark contrast, if we look at India, some work that we ourselves did showed that the harm from smokeless tobacco is, we're seeing rates of oral cancer, head and neck cancer that are 30 or 40-fold higher in those using smokeless tobacco. And that is by far the most prevalent form of tobacco used in India. So it's more than double prevalence of biddies. It's more than fourfold the use of cigarettes in that region. So we really need to provide safer forms of smokeless tobacco in all parts of the world, not just in high-income countries such as Sweden. And the policies do not reflect that. So snus has been available in Sweden, Norway, but not in the rest of Europe. And these safer smokeless products would be a game changer, really, for places like India, where 30% of men are using very dangerous smokeless products. And then let's move a little bit to downstream. We're talking about individuals. What we're really talking about today is users moving away from being patients to being consumers. And certainly in public health, that's a very new concept, and we have not pivoted at all to factor that in. We talked a little bit about cultural, looking at the culture of why and how people smoke, and I think we need to factor in what products people are using. The conventional empower type initiatives that have been on offer, they do not tackle many of the local products used. The local products almost bypass those types of initiatives. And so we really need to have tailored interventions that factor in what's being used in different geographies. I'll touch on misinformation and the fact that 80% of doctors think nicotine causes cancer really does leave little hope for the public to have the right information. Social media plays a huge role for the public, but in our work, we found that even peer-reviewed research provides a huge amount of misinformation. So we wanted to see what journalists, policymakers, decision makers, what they would face if they conducted a search, say, on Google Scholar for the harms from vaping. And we were looking for 25 decent articles, and we needed to scroll through almost 500 articles, before we found 25 that were credible. So 20%, 1 in 5 of those papers. So we use very specific standard mesh terms for harms from nicotine vaping. 1 in 5 of those articles were on the EVALI outbreak, which we all know, and I hope the audience know, was clearly not from nicotine vaping. It was from the use of illicit THC oils. Another 8% was on different forms of cannabis use. A lot of the other articles were opinion pieces, people's opinions, and or were reporting acute responses to exposure. So one may have a slightly raised heart rate or respiratory rate, but that does not translate to disease later down the line. And so this misinformation is happening even in peer-reviewed publications. And so we do need journals and journal editors and everybody on board with this fight, not just social media. So I'll stop there, but happy to add any more.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And fantastic. And I think it's interesting. I keep testing ChatGPT, which I'm sure we're all into these days, to see what are they saying about the benefits of whether it's pouch or snus or vaping. And I think they're getting better and better. I think the more we educate them, educate whatever it is, the algorithm is giving a far more balanced approach than I think the kind of review that you did, Kotha. And that long-term may be very important, because it means that there obviously is a way in which good science can actually break through against bad science. The problem I always remind people of is that while EVALI, the story about it being really a real thing causing problems in e-cigarette users, which it wasn't, or that e-cigarette use increases heart disease, which it doesn't, or that e-cigarette use causes certain cancers, which it doesn't. All of those were in scholarly journals, and there were retractions for each of those. The problem is, once something's retracted, it besides the journal having the responsibility to simply say it's gone, there is no further responsibility to go through the complex channels that it's found its way into. And years later, we find, for example, the original article on cardiovascular disease and e-cigarettes still popping up in policy fora, still popping up in government programs. So we almost need to have a radioactive tracer capability to attach to a retraction and make sure that wherever it pops up in the internet, it should immediately come up with a big retraction sign. I would imagine that digitally and using some of our AI capabilities, this is not beyond the possibility to do it. And maybe that's something we should push our folk at Twitter to start doing, do something really useful. The moment something is up that's got a false retracted thing, there should be a banner headline saying this has been retracted, giving the citation. That'd make progress. But let me return to, I think, some of the deeper issues. And I just want to, you all, I know it's still early days yet, but I'd love your response just to one aspect of what the UK seems to be doing. If I understand it right, they are probably the first to focus on people who are homeless, pregnant women who are vulnerable and smoke. And one of their strategies seems to be to place an insert into a cigarette box, letting you know about the benefits of reduced risk products. Now, that strikes me as a multiple set of behavioral economics. It's actually letting the smoker know at the point of smoking what the alternatives are, which is addressing some of their short-termism. It's giving them an incentive to switch, and it's obviously reinforcing it. But love your thoughts about those kind of approaches, because I know they're also regarded by some as contentious, because they're seen as maybe an advert or whatever. But let me go around, maybe Mohammadi, then Jessica, and then Kotha on that.
Sure. Now, look, anything that we can do to encourage people who smoke to think about getting out. I mean, if you think about the stages of change behavior model, from pre-contemplation to contemplation is useful. In the US, of course, as we all know, we are very much restricted by what we can say to the consumers about the benefits of switching. And for that, we have, the modified risk tobacco product pathway, and that's just, has not been very effective. I mean, we had submitted an MRTP application for a smokeless tobacco with a simple claim: if you're a smoker, switch to smokeless tobacco products, and that will reduce your risk of lung cancer. I mean, that's such a no-brainer, but it took FDA 5 years to authorize that. And the evidence is overwhelming. Everybody would agree that smokeless tobacco is far less risky than cigarettes. So, we're really tethered to what FDA will allow us to say. But that's where I think, public health authorities, and Kotha, you mentioned about the fact about physicians, and Jessica, you were talking about other healthcare providers. I think you need a surround sound for the smoker to make them aware of the benefits of switching. I don't know whether, an insert like that would work. Of course, that would be not practical to implement in the US simply because of, FDA's restrictions on what we can communicate. I'd love to hear from you, Kotha, whether that experience has, yielded any benefit. Another dimension that I just want to raise is that, we talk about, people who smoke should be made aware of this through various sources, and all different sources need to provide that. One area that I've found is also very beneficial is friends and family, because people who smoke are always concerned about people who are near and dear, their loved ones. I mean, when we did our studies on nicotine pouches, one of the reasons that they said was that they believe that will reduce the harm to people around you. So I think they can play a role, as well as community leaders, church leaders and pastors. Those are the people that people who smoke would go to. I mean, Black Americans don't have a lot of trust and faith in the medical system, but they will definitely go to the church every Sunday. So those are other areas that we can use to surround and provide them with this information.
Great. Jessica, can I have you?
Yes. So what you're referring to, again, I go back to kind of what we know, and it is basic human behavior and the psychology of behavior. So think about the warnings, and think about the graphic warnings that I know they have in other countries outside of the United States, and they're looking to implement it here. That's positive punishment is what that's called at a very basic behavior level. You're applying something. You're applying a stimulus to reduce a behavior. So in these instances, you're applying a graphic warning or a warning in the hopes of reducing smoking. The example you gave is it's reinforcement. So you're actually giving a stimulus to change a behavior, but you're giving a positive stimulus. The insert into a cigarette pack is not, you're giving information to hope to change the smoking behavior at the time of actual behavior. That is one of the most basic fundamental properties for successful behavior change. Get them at when they're behaving, get them giving them a stimulus that is positive. People don't respond to negativity. So it's very interesting when you start to dichotomize almost what the United States is looking to do and the barriers they're placing on industry to be able to do what we actually know works and is effective at behavior change. We also know, I'm assuming, Derek, in those inserts, maybe it's a coupon, maybe it's reduction of price, or maybe it's free right away or something like that. That's also incentivizing a change of behavior. So again, if we can close this gap as to where we are in the US and how we're targeting people who smoke and trying to get them to change and make it a little bit more like how the UK and other countries are doing, we might be able to see a reduction in smoking. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think one thing we also need to remember that the UK is a very heterogeneous country. You have a wide range of social class, race, ethnic groups, small neighborhoods. So I think, and people are very aware of it in the UK. It's embraced, that diversity. And I think these initiatives also therefore have implications around the world where the so many of the diaspora come from. Kotha, let me turn to you.
Yeah, what the Department of Health have announced to be implemented imminently in the UK is fantastic, and I really hope other countries will follow suit. They have really given a very clear message that tobacco harm reduction products, reduced risk products, are a fantastic way a fantastic part of the arsenal to stop smoking, and they're giving people choice in how they stop smoking, and they're using many behavioral tools as part of that. As well as the clear messaging from an entity with a lot of authority, they're giving for pregnant women. So as Derek mentioned, we have a huge level of inequality, diversity in terms of health. 1 in 10 pregnant women smoke overall. In some parts of the country, it's much higher than that. And so the plan is to give financial incentives to pregnant women to stop smoking, which is fantastic. Smokers will get a free trial of vapes, so a vape starter kit with behavioral and psychological support, which again deals with some of the affordability. And one of the areas we touched on before is people in the community just being left to it. And again, providing that support, that behavioral, psychological support, as well as allowing people to try vapes for themselves will be a great help. So really look forward to seeing how much impact this has. And of course, the UK, the goal is to end smoking by 2030. So, within 7 years. So really is quite an ambitious target.
Great. Yeah, so one of the things I recall when I went to one of the first IQOS stores in Japan, and was fascinated to see really the sort of the intensity of the in-store counseling. It was very much like being in a pharmacy, and with an explicit focus on smokers being encouraged to try these products with a lot of advice and support and encouragement and empathy and respect. And in Japan, of course, respect is that you don't do that, you're not going to make any progress. And yet, going back to Jessica's diagram, we know vaping stores are being closed or being put under pressure. The very places where there's the potential for real intimate outreach. And anybody who's been into a vaping store knows that the vaping owners don't just see them there as themselves being there as trying to fleece the public and make a lot of money. They genuinely are trying to help smokers get onto their products and improve the quality of their lives, because most of them, that's what they came from. one of the things I was also thought about all those years ago was, how do we reinforce people and give them the reward when they've made it past the first month or 2 months or 3 months? And I proposed to a bunch of people who never took it seriously. So anybody on the call is welcome to take it up. I think if somebody can show that they've successfully switched to either a vape or a pouch or whatever, they should be given by the manufacturer two things. One is a coupon to go and take their clothes to be laundered and dry cleaned, to symbolize that they will not have to do that for a very long time, yet they were probably having to do it a lot with the heavy smoke that tarred them. And that is both symbolic, but in behavioral economic terms, it acts very powerfully to reinforce something positive. The other one was an oral hygienist visit. And again, it sends a signal that once you've actually switched off a combustible product, your probability of caries continuing at the rate that you may have it is substantially reduced, as well as periodontal disease. And that reinforces it in people's minds. I'm sure there are many other things we could be doing as well, but I think those two I thought struck me as something that are still ripe and waiting out there. So this has been a very rich session. And for me, I think we were spending much more time talking about the struggles of smokers, stigmatization, and some of the ways we need to overcome that than we usually do when we focus on the pure technology and epidemiological one. Right. So I'm going to just ask you all to really just think, what is the last message or idea or comment that you might have for the audience before we leave? And I'll start with Mohammadi and then go to Jessica and then end with Kotha. Mohammadi.
No, sure. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and what a great panel. Yeah, this has been such a wonderful discussion. So I'm delighted to be part of this. As we end, I think I want to end on a positive note. I think that harm reduction is within our reach. I think that we have an opportunity to be really successful. And as long as we can get rid of these barriers that I talked about, getting accurate information in the hands of people who smoke, and getting the products that are authorized by FDA, at least in the US, that is one of the barriers, getting FDA authorized products in the hands and equip them with accurate information. That in itself will give them the power and the control over making an informed decision on themselves. So I'm very hopeful. And one point that I do want to also make in closing is that, you mentioned about some of the reinforcing effects. We have seen that as people who smoke switch to these products, they start experiencing improvements in the quality of life. And that in itself is a reinforcing effect that motivates them to stick with that behavior. So I'm very hopeful that the future is bright for those people who smoke. And if they are unable or unwilling to quit, there are going to be options available.
Thanks, Mohammadi. Jessica.
Thank you so much, Derek, for the invite for this panel. This has been a wonderful discussion. It's been wonderful to hear from you, Mohammadi, and Kotha as well. I think the big thing, as Mohammadi is saying, is keeping in mind the person who smokes. So I would encourage any policymaker, any regulatory body, any individual working, conducting research in tobacco control or within CTP, I would encourage them to find a way to talk with adult smokers, to talk with people who smoke, to sit down and hear their story, hear their struggles, and don't do it just in one location. Go around the country, go around the world, because in order for us to better provide people who smoke with products, with the programs, with the policies to help them stop smoking, we have got to come face to face with them, and we have got to show an empathetic approach to their lives. So I would really encourage people to see the life through a person who smokes. And then I would encourage industry to work better together. I know that there are definitely the competition and the competitive proprietary information. But if we can all come together, industry, CROs, the FDA, healthcare providers, and other people who are of interest at this topic, I think we're going to solve the problem much quicker than if we do it in isolation and in our silos.
Thank you. Now I'll come back to that at the end. Kotha? Sorry, let me just unmute you. Okay.
So to add to that, I'd really like to see that users are not allowed to struggle on their own if they choose a harm reduction approach, and that we provide an environment and ecosystem to support them. And I'd like to just give a case study of a real life case study from my own life recently. I was traveling in Pakistan, and a colleague who was an ex-smoker had been using vapes to successfully stop smoking for a couple of years. Pakistan, of course, vapes are not available. And so despite this colleague being a doctor himself, medical doctor, works in the healthy aging space, and knows full well the harms from smoking, could not access nicotine replacement in that country, and so had to use cigarettes. And so it's not, we can't put all of the onus on the user. We have to provide the environment that helps people to quit.
Great. Thank you. That last story, Kotha, reminds me of meeting a senior diplomat in Geneva a few years ago, who was a heavy smoker, and he was from Cameroon in West Africa. And he finally managed to get, I think it was either vapes or heated tobacco product, whatever it was, but he had to fill up his suitcase every time he flew to Geneva because they were not available at home or they were impossible to get hold of. And this does speak to the desperate needs that I think Kotha mentioned as well, about industry's role to actually be far more active in low middle income countries, knowing that in many of those low middle income countries, there aren't bans and regulations. The opportunity for market creation is still huge and the demand is massive. Take Nigeria. I'm unaware of any of the reduced risk or harm reduction products being actively available through serious companies in Nigeria, the most populous country on the African continent. Well, before ending, I think we've all echoed that theme of nothing for us without us, which was the refrain of the HIV/AIDS movement at the start. And without that, we probably wouldn't have seen the acceleration in better therapies that made a difference, the focus on equity, reducing the impact of the disease. That really was the hallmark of some of the progress we saw in HIV/AIDS. We need to think about applying it here. And I can't let Jessica's comment go by. I do think your point about industry sharing a lot more that may be in a non-proprietary to them, particularly related to consumer insights. We know that no company goes out and sells a consumer good without having in-depth, very detailed insights into consumer behavior, into what drives change, into what is successful in terms of maintaining people in a smoke-free state. And of course, many of them would look to that data as being proprietary. It's the basis of their profitability. But there are ways these days to share that data in a pooled collective. And I think there should be a coming together of the larger companies, vape, tobacco, pouch, snus companies, to think about how they can share that for the public good, so that the academic community will get a jump up on understanding where are the true constraints and barriers in a non-branded way that would help, I think, everybody make progress in this field. I saw that happen to some extent in the food sector. I know it happens in some extent in the pharmaceutical sector. So why not in our sector? And I would make a plea to everybody watching from the different corporate backgrounds you are. Let's think what you could be doing far more to share your best insights about making progress with the wider community, so that we can actually make sure the best is available. I'll add back to Mohammadi for one last comment.
I feel compelled to respond to that. Look, I think that's a great comment that you and Jessica made. But in order for us to be able to share these insights, we need a venue, a platform to do that.
Yeah,
And
no, I completely agree.
and
Yeah.
I think public health researchers would greatly benefit on getting to speak with us on our consumer insights. But the doors are always shut. And how can we break those barriers and open up the doors so we can have a dialogue with the common goal? Because I think we would all agree the common goal for all of us is to seek solutions for those people who are unable or unwilling to quit. And with
Yeah.
that common goal, I think we need to come up with ways in which we can share and have an exchange of ideas of what are some of the best ways to achieve the success.
Yeah, and I think there are ways that it can be done where you can strip away any of the detailed proprietary information. There can be details, but I don't want to get into the details. I think the principle is very powerful. How do we share the best insights that affect in the end? It's consumers, it's smokers, it's our product. And I think it does speak to the fact that the public health community has actually expunged the smoker from their research focus, from the interaction over the years, as Kotha said so well. Well, the industry knows that that's not the way you're going to make progress. You've got to go the other route. And somehow coming together of those two in a safe space, in a way that's carefully thought through, could make a big difference and hopefully make progress for everyone. So let me just thank you all and thank all of you watching this GTNF in focus. And a very warm thanks to Mohammadi, Jessica, and Kotha for a great discussion. And let's hope that our words have impact down the line. Thank you all.
Thank you, Derek.
Thank you.
A big thanks to all of the panelists for a most informative panel. We have arrived at the last keynote speech of the day, given by Associate Professor Jeremy Lim. Professor Lim is Director for Global Health at the Saw Sui Hock School of Public Health at the National University of Singapore. Professor Lim leads the initiatives in health systems, strengthening and universal health coverage. He brings diverse and unique perspectives, having spent substantial time in public and private healthcare across Asia, as well as in policy advisory with Singapore's Ministry of Health, the World Bank, and the World Health Organization. Professor Lim, the floor is yours.